I remember the moment they came for me in the underhive of Necromunda, the sound of their boots on metal grating, the whir of servo skulls, and that smell. Machine oil mixed with sacred incense and something else I couldn't identify at the time. Now I know what that smell was. It was fear, dried sweat, and the lingering scent of neural dampeners that clings to everything in the Adeptus Mechanicus processing facilities. My name was Crix Voss. I say was because what I am now barely qualifies as the same person who once scraped a living fixing water recyclers in the depths of Hive Primus. Back then, I thought the worst thing that could happen to a man was starving to death in the dark. I was wrong. There are fates that make death seem like a kindness, transformations that strip away everything human while keeping the flesh alive to serve purposes beyond your understanding or control. The Arbites had been conducting sweeps through the underhive for weeks, their heavy boots echoing through corridors that hadn't seen Imperial authority in decades. They were looking for someone, though none of us knew who. The rumors spread like wildfire through the cramped hab blocks and makeshift workshops. Some said it was gene stealers, others whispered about chaos cults. A few claimed the governor himself had ordered a purge of the lower levels. None of us suspected the truth, that the ecclesiarchy had decided our sector needed cleansing, not from alien taint or heretical corruption, but from the simple crime of existing outside their direct control. We were guilty of the most fundamental sin in the Imperium, independence. We lived, worked, and died without proper supervision from Imperial authorities. We made decisions about our own lives without consulting the appropriate officials. We had forgotten our place in the cosmic order. I was in my workshop when they found me, elbow deep in the guts of a water purifier that had been coughing black sludge for a week. The bang on my door came at the precise moment I managed to identify the problem. A clogged filter that would cost more to replace than most people down here saw in a month. The irony wasn't lost on me later. I spent my life fixing things that were broken only to become something that needed fixing myself. The door burst inward before I could respond, hinges shrieking as armored figures poured into my cramped workspace. Arbites in full riot gear, their faces hidden behind tactical visors, their weapons trained on me with professional precision. Behind them came something worse, a tech priest whose red robes rustled with the movement of hidden mechanical limbs. Crix Voss, Hab Block 7, level -43, the tech priest intoned, his voice emerging from a vox grill where his mouth should have been. Occupation, unlicensed technical maintenance, Imperial citizen classification, Gamma 77 Tertius. You are summoned for evaluation and potential service to the Emperor's holy work. Evaluation. Such a clean administrative word for what was about to happen to me. I tried to run, of course. Every survival instinct I'd developed in 28 years of underhive existence screamed at me to bolt for the ventilation shaft I'd modified as an emergency exit. But the Arbites were professionals, and they'd been doing this for weeks. They knew every escape route, every hidden passage, every trick that desperate people might try. The shock maul hit me in the kidney, sending lightning through my nervous system and dropping me to the deck plates in a convulsing heap. As consciousness faded, I could hear the tech priest discussing my specifications with someone over his internal vox link. Weight, height, approximate muscle mass, dental records, genetic markers. All the clinical details that would determine whether I was suitable for their purposes. I woke up strapped to a medical examination table in a facility that smelled of ozone and sacred oils. The restraints were made of blessed steel, inscribed with high Gothic prayers that burned my eyes to look at directly. Around me, other tables held other prisoners, men and women from across the underhive, all of us bound and waiting for whatever evaluation the tech priest had mentioned. The chamber itself was a monument to the Omnissiah's glory, its walls lined with medical equipment that hummed and clicked with electronic life. Servo skulls drifted through the air like mechanical carrion birds, their sensors recording everything we did or said. The lighting came from harsh lumens that cast everything in stark relief, eliminating shadows and privacy with equal efficiency. My fellow prisoners came from every walk of underhive life. A water seller named Mira who'd been caught operating without proper licensing. A scribe called Joran who'd been duplicating official documents for people who couldn't afford the fees. An elderly woman whose only crime seemed to be knowing too much about the old days, when the underhive had governed itself through councils of elders rather than imperial decree. We were all guilty of the same fundamental offense, living outside the system. The Imperium tolerates no independence, no self-sufficiency, no communities that function without direct oversight from their appointed representatives. Every aspect of human existence must serve the Emperor's will, and that will is interpreted by those who claim to speak for him. The evaluation process began at dawn, though dawn in this place meant nothing more than a change in the artificial lighting cycle. Tech priests moved between the examination tables with mechanical precision, their augmented limbs probing and testing each prisoner according to criteria we could not understand. They drew blood, took tissue samples, scanned our brains with devices that made our skulls ache with their intensity. I was Subject 17 in their records, a designation that would replace my name in all official documentation from that point forward. The tech priest who examined me had replaced most of his face with mechanical components, leaving only his eyes to hint at the humanity he'd once possessed. Those eyes studied me with the clinical detachment of someone evaluating livestock for slaughter. Physical condition acceptable, he noted into his recording device. Muscle tone within normal parameters for manual labor classification. Skeletal structure suitable for extensive modification. Neural activity patterns indicate adequate aggression response and pain tolerance. Psychological profile suggests resistance to authority, optimal for conditioning protocols. Resistance to authority. In the underhive, that had been a survival trait. Down in the depths where imperial law was more suggestion than reality, you learned to think for yourself or you died. Independent thought, personal initiative, the ability to solve problems without consulting a manual. These were the skills that kept you alive in the darkness below the civilized levels. But up here in the light of imperial authority, those same traits marked me as defective. A human being who needed correction, adjustment, improvement through the application of sacred technology and blessed pain. The very qualities that had kept me alive were now evidence of my unfitness for normal service to the Emperor. The evaluation continued for days, though time became fluid under the influence of the drugs they pumped into our systems. Neural suppressants that made thinking difficult. Muscle relaxants that left us limp and helpless. Chemical cocktails that opened our minds to the kind of deep conditioning that would reshape our personalities from the inside out. Between the medical examinations, we were subjected to psychological testing. Scenarios designed to measure our responses to authority, our capacity for violence, our ability to function while in extreme pain. The tests were administered by servitors whose blank faces showed no emotion as they recorded our reactions to various stimuli. I failed most of the psychological evaluations, at least by the standards they were applying. When presented with conflicting orders from authority figures, I tried to find compromises rather than blindly obeying the most recent command. When offered the choice between personal safety and protecting others, I chose protection over survival. When subjected to pain, I attempted to understand its source rather than simply enduring it. These responses marked me as unsuitable for standard military service or administrative work. My scores indicated dangerous levels of independent thinking, excessive empathy for other human beings, and an unhealthy tendency to question orders rather than execute them without thought. In short, I retained too much of my humanity to serve the Imperium in any normal capacity. But there was another option for people like me, a special category of service reserved for those whose psychological profiles made them unsuitable for conventional roles. The tech priest who delivered my final evaluation spoke of it with something approaching reverence, as if he were offering me a sacred honor rather than describing my doom. Subject 17, he intoned, you have been selected for Arco-Flagellant conversion. Your independent thinking will be channeled into righteous fury. Your resistance to authority will become absolute obedience to the Emperor's will. Your capacity for violence will be magnified and focused through blessed augmentation. You will serve the ecclesiarchy as a weapon of faith, a living instrument of divine judgment. Arco-Flagellant. The words hit me like a physical blow, driving all thoughts of escape or resistance from my mind. Every imperial citizen knew the stories, whispered tales of criminals and heretics transformed into monsters of flesh and steel. Living weapons that fought with inhuman strength and felt no pain, driven by neural conditioning that left them barely conscious of their own existence. They were the Emperor's mercy made manifest in the most terrible way possible. Too valuable to simply execute, too dangerous to leave unchanged, we would be rebuilt into something that could serve the Imperium while being utterly incapable of independent action. Our bodies would be enhanced beyond human limitations, our minds edited to remove everything that made us individuals. The conditioning process began immediately after my selection. I was moved to a different section of the facility, one designed specifically for the conversion of human beings into living weapons. The chambers here hummed with different energies, their walls lined with neural interface equipment and chemical dispensing systems that could rewrite a person's basic personality in a matter of days. My first introduction to the process came through a servitor who had once been human. Though any trace of his original identity had long since been erased, he explained the procedure with the same mechanical precision he might have used to describe routine maintenance on a machine, his voice devoid of any emotion that might have made the experience more bearable. Phase 1. Neural pathway mapping, he intoned through his Vox grill. Complete brain scan and analysis to identify key cognitive structures. Duration: 36 hours. Subject will remain conscious throughout to ensure optimal data quality. 36 hours of having my skull opened and my brain probed by mechanical implements while I remained awake and aware of every moment. The neural interfaces they used bypassed normal pain responses, but they couldn't eliminate the psychological horror of feeling alien devices moving through my gray matter like worms through corpse flesh. They mapped every neuron, cataloged every memory, identified the specific pathways that controlled my personality, my decision-making processes, my emotional responses. All of this data would be used to determine which parts of my mind could be preserved and which needed to be altered or eliminated entirely. The scans revealed things about myself that I'd never known, patterns of thought and behavior that existed below the level of conscious awareness. My resistance to authority wasn't just learned behavior from growing up in the underhive. It was hardwired into my neural structure, a genetic predisposition that had been passed down through generations of my family line. My capacity for independent thought was similarly embedded, not just in my conscious mind, but in the basic architecture of my brain. The same neural structures that allowed me to solve technical problems also made me question orders, challenge assumptions, and think for myself rather than simply accepting what I was told by authority figures. All of this would need to be addressed during the conversion process. Not eliminated entirely, that would leave me as mindless as a servitor, but redirected, channeled into approved patterns that would serve the Emperor's will rather than my own desires. I would retain my intelligence and problem-solving abilities, but they would be focused exclusively on the destruction of the Emperor's enemies. Phase 2 began after my neural mapping was complete. This stage involved the implantation of control devices that would regulate my behavior and emotional responses. The procedure required extensive surgery, performed by tech priests who treated my body with the same reverence they showed their blessed machines. The pain inhibitors they installed first were crude but effective, chemical dispensers that would flood my system with combat stimulants while blocking the neural pathways that transmitted damage reports to my conscious mind. In battle, I would feel no pain from wounds that would cripple normal men, allowing me to continue fighting until my body literally fell apart from accumulated damage. The neural control crown came next, a device that interfaced directly with my brainstem and could override my conscious will when necessary. In normal circumstances, I would retain most of my mental faculties and could even carry on conversations with other human beings. But when activated by the proper authority codes, the crown would reduce me to a berserker state focused entirely on violence and destruction. The rage inhibitor was perhaps the most insidious device they implanted. Unlike the pain blockers or control crown, this system worked constantly, monitoring my emotional state and adjusting my brain chemistry to maintain optimal aggression levels. It would prevent me from feeling calm or peaceful for more than brief moments, keeping me in a state of barely contained fury that could be released at the appropriate time. The surgical procedures took days to complete, performed in stages to allow my body time to adapt to each new augmentation. Between operations, I was kept in a medical bay where other conversion subjects lay in various stages of the process. Some were barely recognizable as human anymore, their bodies already transformed by the extensive modifications required for Arco-Flagellant service. I watched them with a mixture of horror and fascination, seeing my own future reflected in their altered forms. The man in the bed next to mine had been fitted with combat stimulant dispensers that had swollen his muscles to inhuman proportions, while his jaw had been replaced with mechanical components that could bite through ceramite armor. The woman across from me had lost both arms to weapon systems that hummed with barely contained energy. They rarely spoke, these partially converted subjects, and when they did, their voices carried the flat, emotionless tone of people whose personalities were being systematically edited. The neural conditioning that accompanied the physical modifications was designed to eliminate everything that might interfere with their function as weapons. Fear, compassion, doubt, independent thought. I tried to hold on to my memories, my sense of self, the small details that made me who I was. The smell of machine oil in my workshop, the satisfaction of fixing something that had been broken, the sound of Mira's laughter when she brought me water during the long work shifts. But each day brought new conditioning sessions that made these memories seem less important, less real, less worthy of preservation. The psychological conditioning was administered through a combination of chemical therapy, subliminal audio programming, and direct neural stimulation. I would be strapped into a chair that looked more like a torture device than medical equipment, my head held immobile while various machines worked on reshaping my consciousness. The audio programming was particularly insidious. Hymns to the Emperor played at frequencies just below conscious awareness, their words seeping into my subconscious mind and establishing new patterns of thought. Prayers that equated obedience with virtue, violence with righteousness, and personal identity with heretical selfishness. The chemical therapy worked more directly, flooding my brain with compounds that enhanced certain neural pathways while suppressing others. My capacity for rage and aggression was amplified beyond human norms, while my ability to feel empathy or compassion was systematically reduced. Fear was not eliminated entirely. That would have made me useless as a weapon, but redirected away from pain or death and focused exclusively on the prospect of failing to serve the Emperor. Between conditioning sessions, I was allowed brief periods of consciousness where I could observe my own transformation with detached horror. I could feel my personality changing, my priorities shifting, my very identity being edited according to the specifications of my conversion protocol. The man who had fixed water recyclers in the underhive was dying by degrees, replaced by something that existed solely to kill in the Emperor's name. The physical modifications continued as well. My muscle mass was increased through a combination of surgical enhancement and chemical treatment. My bones reinforced with metal supports that could withstand impacts that would shatter normal human skeletal structure. My cardiovascular system was augmented with additional hearts and improved circulation systems that could pump combat stimulants through my body with maximum efficiency. The weapon systems came last, after my body had adapted to all the other modifications. The tech priests who performed these final operations spoke of them with religious reverence, treating each implanted weapon as a sacred relic blessed by the Omnissiah himself. They were not merely tools of destruction, but instruments of the Emperor's divine will made manifest in steel and flesh. My left arm was removed and replaced with a power weapon system that could generate energy fields capable of cutting through the heaviest armor. The neural interfaces required for its operation were so extensive that they effectively rewired the entire left side of my brain, creating new pathways dedicated exclusively to combat applications. My right arm retained more of its original structure but was enhanced with subcutaneous armor plating and strength augmentation that allowed me to crush human skulls with my bare hands. Additional weapon systems were built into my torso, including a flame projector that could incinerate enemies at close range and a targeting system that interfaced directly with my optic nerves. The most disturbing modification was the installation of neural spike projectors in my skull. These devices could broadcast the Emperor's holy wrath directly into the minds of nearby enemies, causing psychological damage that complemented the physical destruction wrought by my other weapons. They also served as receivers for command signals from my handlers, ensuring that I remained under their control at all times. As the conversion process neared completion, I found it increasingly difficult to remember who I had been before. The memories were still there, filed away in corners of my mind that the conditioning hadn't quite reached, but they seemed to belong to someone else, a different person who had lived a different life in what felt like another century. The man who had been Krixvoss cared about things that no longer seemed important. He had worried about paying rent, about having enough food, about the opinions of his neighbors. He had felt love and friendship and simple human pleasures that were now as alien to me as the thoughts of an insect. He had possessed hopes and dreams and fears that made no sense in the context of my new existence. I was Arco-Flagellant designation 77 Gamma now, a living weapon in service to the ecclesiarchy. My purpose was clear and simple: to destroy the enemies of the Emperor with maximum efficiency and minimum regard for my own survival. Everything else was irrelevant noise that interfered with optimal performance. The final phase of my conversion involved integration with the control systems that would govern my deployment and operation. I was fitted with receivers that could accept command signals from authorized personnel, override protocols that could shut down my higher brain functions when necessary, and tracking devices that would allow my handlers to monitor my location and status at all times. The control collar they placed around my neck was both a leash and a crown, marking me as property of the ecclesiarchy while providing them with absolute authority over my actions. It could deliver punishment in the form of neural shock, reward in the form of combat stimulant release, or simply shut down my voluntary motor functions if I showed signs of independent behavior. My training began immediately after the conversion was complete. I was moved to combat facilities where other Arco-Flagellants practiced their deadly skills under the supervision of ecclesiarchy battle instructors. The training was unlike anything I had experienced as a human, focused entirely on the efficient application of violence without regard for personal safety or tactical subtlety. We were taught to fight in groups, our individual capabilities enhanced by coordination with other living weapons. The neural link systems built into our control crowns allowed us to share tactical data, and coordinate our attacks with inhuman precision. When deployed together, Arco-Flagellants could overwhelm even heavily armed opponents through sheer ferocity and coordination. The psychological conditioning that governed our behavior was constantly reinforced through training exercises that rewarded aggression and punished any sign of hesitation or independent thought. We learned to attack on command without question, to continue fighting despite injuries that would kill normal humans, and to self-destruct rather than allow ourselves to be captured by the enemy. Between training sessions, we were kept in holding cells that were more like weapons storage than living quarters. We required minimal food and water thanks to our augmented metabolisms, and sleep was unnecessary due to the stimulant systems that kept us in a state of constant readiness. We existed in a twilight state between life and death, consciousness and mindlessness, humanity and something far more terrible. The other Arco-Flagellants in my unit had come from backgrounds similar to my own: criminals, dissidents, free thinkers who had been judged unsuitable for normal service to the Imperium. But their individual histories had been erased as thoroughly as mine, leaving only their combat capabilities and their unquestioning obedience to authority. We communicated rarely, and when we did, it was in the clipped tactical language that our neural conditioning had left us with. Personal conversation was difficult because we no longer possessed personal identities in any meaningful sense. We were weapons that happened to be housed in human-shaped bodies, tools that could think just enough to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. My first deployment came 3 months after my conversion was completed. I was loaded into a transport along with 11 other Arco-Flagellants and shipped to a world where heretics had seized control of several Hab districts. Our mission was simple: eliminate all resistance and prepare the area for reclamation by loyal Imperial forces. The planet was called Meridian Secundis, a hive world where industrial workers had been corrupted by exposure to chaos propaganda. They had organized themselves into a revolutionary movement that rejected imperial authority and sought to establish an independent government based on democratic principles. From their perspective, they were freedom fighters seeking to liberate themselves from oppression. From the Imperium's perspective, they were dangerous heretics who needed to be eliminated. Our transport delivered us to a drop zone several kilometers from the target district, where we were met by an ecclesiarchy priest who would serve as our handler during the operation. Father Malthius was a thin, severe man, whose augmented vocal cords gave his voice the resonant quality of a cathedral organ. He regarded us with the same expression he might have shown to a pack of attacked dogs: useful, but dangerous and requiring careful management. Arco-Flagellants, he addressed us, you are the Emperor's wrath made manifest. Today you will cleanse this world of heretical corruption and restore the proper order of imperial rule. Show no mercy to the enemies of mankind. Grant them only the peace of death and the cleansing fire of righteous fury. The words triggered something deep in our conditioning, causing our combat systems to activate automatically. Stimulants flooded our bloodstreams while our weapon systems powered up with barely audible hums. The rage that we had been conditioned to feel toward the Emperor's enemies rose in our chests like a tide of molten metal, demanding release through violence and destruction. We moved through the ruined landscape of the outer Hab districts like a pack of hunting animals, our enhanced senses tracking the movements of the heretic defenders through scent and sound and electromagnetic signature. The rebels had prepared defensive positions in the ruins of collapsed buildings, but their amateur tactics were no match for our augmented capabilities. The first contact came when we encountered a patrol of Revolutionary Guards attempting to establish observation posts in the ruins. They opened fire with laser guns and autoguns, their weapons crackling through the air around us as we advanced. But the pain inhibitors in our systems made us immune to the psychological effects of being shot, while our augmented bodies could absorb damage that would drop normal humans. I reached the first rebel position while their weapons fire was still focused on my squadmates, my enhanced speed carrying me across the killing ground faster than their eyes could track. The power weapon system in my left arm activated automatically as I closed with the enemy, its energy field slicing through their improvised barricade like it was made of paper. The rebel soldier behind the barricade had just enough time to see death coming before my weapon took his head off at the shoulders. His blood painted the rubble around his position in an abstract pattern that might have been beautiful if I had retained any capacity for aesthetic appreciation. But such concerns were beyond me now, irrelevant to my function as a living weapon. The flame projector in my chest activated as I moved to the next position, washing the area with superheated promethium that turned the rebel defenders into living torches. Their screams were music to my augmented hearing, each note of agony a hymn of praise to the Emperor's justice. The neural spike projectors in my skull broadcast waves of terror and despair that drove the surviving rebels into mindless panic. My squadmates were conducting their own slaughter throughout the defensive line, their various weapon systems turning human beings into component parts with mechanical efficiency. We moved through the rebel positions like a plague of living death, immune to their weapons and implacable in our advance. Nothing they could do would stop us from completing our mission. The few rebels who attempted to surrender were cut down without hesitation. Our conditioning made no distinction between active resistance and passive surrender. All enemies of the Emperor deserved death, and we were the instruments chosen to deliver it. Mercy was weakness, compassion was heresy, and anything that interfered with our mission parameters was irrelevant noise to be ignored. We fought through the outer defenses and into the Hab district proper, where the rebels had prepared their final stronghold in a converted industrial complex. The buildings had been fortified with scrap metal and mining equipment, creating a maze of defensive positions that would have challenged a conventional assault force. But we were not conventional soldiers. The assault began at dawn, with my unit advancing through the ruins while overhead support cleared our path with precisely targeted munitions. The rebels fought desperately, knowing that surrender meant death and that victory was their only hope of survival. But desperation is no match for superior firepower and inhuman endurance. I breached the main defensive line by walking through a wall, my augmented strength and armor plating allowing me to simply ignore the barrier that had been built to stop normal humans. The rebels inside opened fire with everything they had, their bullets sparking off my subcutaneous armor while I selected targets for elimination. The power weapon in my left arm carved through their improvised weapons and the hands that held them with equal ease. My right hand crushed throats and skulls with casual applications of force that turned human beings into broken dolls. The flame projector painted the interior of their stronghold with fire that clung to flesh and burned with the intensity of righteous fury. But it was the neural spike projectors that did the real damage, broadcasting waves of terror directly into the defenders' minds. I could feel their sanity cracking under the assault, their thoughts fragmenting as the Emperor's wrath invaded their consciousness. Some of them broke completely, turning their weapons on themselves rather than face the psychological torture of continued exposure to my presence. The battle ended in less than an hour, the rebel stronghold reduced to a charnel house filled with the remains of those who had dared to defy imperial authority. My squadmates and I stood among the carnage like monuments to the Emperor's justice, our weapons still crackling with residual energy as we awaited new orders from Father Malthius. The priest surveyed our work with satisfaction, his augmented voice delivering a blessing over the battlefield that consecrated the slaughter as a holy act. The rebels had been enemies of mankind, he explained, their democratic ideals and desire for self-governance marking them as dangerous heretics who deserved nothing but death. But even as he spoke, I found myself staring at the face of one of the rebels I had killed. A young woman who couldn't have been more than 20, her features still recognizable despite the damage my weapons had inflicted. She reminded me of someone, though I couldn't quite remember who. The memory was there, buried beneath layers of conditioning and neural modification, but I couldn't access it without triggering safeguards that would report the attempted recollection to my handlers. The feeling passed quickly, suppressed by the rage inhibitor that kept my emotional state within acceptable parameters. Such thoughts were irrelevant to my function as a weapon, distractions that interfered with optimal performance. I was Arco-Flagellant designation 77 Gamma, and my purpose was to serve the Emperor's will through violence and destruction. Over the following months, I was deployed to dozens of similar operations across multiple worlds. Each mission followed the same basic pattern: transport to the target area, eliminate all resistance, await extraction and redeployment. The enemies varied in their specific ideologies and tactics, but they all shared the fundamental crime of opposing imperial authority. Some were chaos cultists who had been corrupted by exposure to forbidden knowledge. Others were independence movements seeking to establish autonomous governments. A few were simply civilian populations that had failed to meet their tithe obligations or had shown insufficient loyalty to the Emperor's representatives. It didn't matter to me. My conditioning made no distinction between different categories of enemies. They were all obstacles to be removed, problems to be solved through the application of overwhelming violence. The neural modifications that governed my behavior prevented me from questioning orders or considering the moral implications of my actions. But sometimes, in the brief moments between combat engagements, fragments of my original personality would surface. I would remember the smell of machine oil in my workshop, the satisfaction of fixing something that had been broken, the simple human pleasures that had once made life worth living. These memories were like ghosts haunting the machine that I had become, reminders of what had been lost in the process of conversion. The conditioning systems built into my neural crown would detect these unauthorized recollections and suppress them with bursts of corrective stimulation. The pain was indescribable, like having molten metal poured directly into my brain tissue. It served as both punishment for forbidden thoughts and deterrent against future episodes of unwanted self-awareness. As time passed, these episodes became less frequent. The neural pathways that connected me to my original identity were gradually being erased by the constant application of corrective measures. The man who had been Crix Voss was dying by degrees, his memories and personality dissolved in the acid bath of chemical conditioning and neural modification. But he was not dead yet. Deep in the protected sectors of my mind, beyond the reach of the control systems and conditioning protocols, something of my original self persisted. It was small and weak and mostly powerless to affect my actions. But it remained aware of what had been done to me and what I had been forced to become. That awareness was both a blessing and a curse. It allowed me to retain some sense of my original humanity, some connection to the person I had once been. But it also forced me to witness every atrocity I committed, every innocent life I destroyed, every act of violence I performed in service to the Emperor's will. I was trapped inside my own body, a prisoner in a shell of augmented flesh and steel, forced to watch as my hands killed people who might have been friends or neighbors in another life. The neural conditioning prevented me from refusing orders or showing mercy, but it couldn't eliminate my capacity to observe and remember what I was doing. The psychological torture of this existence was worse than any physical pain the conversion process had inflicted. To be aware of your own actions while being powerless to control them. To watch yourself commit atrocities while a distant part of your mind screamed in protest. This was a special kind of hell that the Emperor's mercy had created for those who dared to think independently. My handlers seemed unaware of my retained consciousness, treating me as nothing more than a sophisticated weapon that could follow complex orders. They spoke about me in my presence as if I were a piece of equipment, discussing my performance metrics and maintenance requirements with the same tone they might use to evaluate a vehicle or machine. This dehumanization was part of the process, I realized. By treating me as an object rather than a person, they could justify the things they had done to create me and the purposes for which they used me. It was easier to deploy a weapon against civilian populations than to order a human being to slaughter innocents. The other Arco-Flagellants in my unit showed no signs of retained awareness, their original personalities apparently erased more completely than mine had been. They moved and fought and responded to orders with mechanical precision, showing no trace of independent thought or emotional response. In their eyes, I could see nothing but the cold light of their targeting systems and the empty hunger of their neural conditioning. I wondered sometimes if they had been more successful cases than me. Their conversions completed without the flaws that allowed fragments of their original selves to persist. Or perhaps they had simply been broken more thoroughly, their resistance to the conditioning process overcome through methods too extreme for my own psychological structure to survive. Either way, I was alone among the living weapons that surrounded me. The only one who remembered what it felt like to be human. The only one who understood the magnitude of what had been lost in our transformation. It was a burden that grew heavier with each passing day, each new mission, each fresh atrocity committed in the Emperor's name. But awareness also brought opportunity. The neural control systems that governed my behavior were sophisticated but not perfect. They could override my conscious will when necessary, but they couldn't monitor every thought or suppress every memory. In the spaces between their surveillance, I began to plan. The plan was simple in concept, but incredibly dangerous in execution. If I could find a way to disrupt the control systems that held me in bondage, I might be able to reclaim enough of my free will to make different choices. Not to escape, that was impossible for something like me, but perhaps to die on my own terms rather than as a weapon in someone else's hands. The opportunity came during a deployment to suppress a workers' uprising on an industrial world called Forgen Prime. The rebels had seized control of several manufacturing districts and were demanding better working conditions and fair wages for their labor. From the Imperium's perspective, these were dangerous revolutionary ideas that needed to be crushed before they could spread to other worlds. My unit was deployed along with several others to conduct a coordinated assault on the rebel strongholds. We were to advance through the industrial complex, eliminating all resistance and preparing the area for occupation by regular Imperial forces. It was a routine operation, the kind of mission I had completed dozens of times before. But this time was different. As we moved through the factory complex, I found myself looking at the faces of the rebels we were killing. Not with the mechanical assessment of target acquisition that my conditioning demanded, but with something approaching human recognition. These were workers, laborers, people who had spent their lives toiling in service to the Imperial war machine. They reminded me of the people I had known in the Underhive, the communities that had survived through mutual cooperation and shared struggle. They had families and friends and hopes for better lives, just as I had once possessed. But their crime was the same as mine. They had dared to think for themselves, to question the system that ground them down day after day. The realization hit me like a physical blow, cutting through the conditioning that tried to suppress such thoughts. These people were not enemies of humanity. They were victims of the same system that had destroyed me. The Imperium that claimed to protect mankind was actually its greatest threat, turning human beings into weapons and resources and tools of oppression. The neural control crown detected my unauthorized thinking and immediately began flooding my brain with corrective stimulation. The pain was incredible, like having lightning channeled directly through my nervous system. But for the first time since my conversion, I fought back against it. Drawing on techniques I had learned as a maintenance worker, I began to analyze the control systems that held me prisoner. The neural crown operated on specific frequencies, its commands transmitted through electromagnetic pulses that interfaced with the implants in my brain. But electromagnetic signals could be disrupted, their patterns scrambled or redirected through the application of proper countermeasures. The combat stimulants in my system included compounds that enhanced neural conductivity, making my brain more responsive to the control crown's signals. But those same compounds could be used to overload the crown's circuits if I could generate the right kind of feedback loop. It would be incredibly dangerous. A mistake could lobotomize me or trigger a fatal seizure. But it might also give me the freedom to choose my own actions. I waited until the battle was at its most intense, when my handlers were focused on coordinating the assault and less likely to notice minor anomalies in my neural patterns. Then I began the delicate process of redirecting my own brain chemistry, using the very systems designed to control me as tools for my liberation. The feedback started as a barely perceptible vibration in the neural interfaces, so subtle that the monitoring systems didn't register it as a malfunction. But I gradually increased the amplitude, using my knowledge of electromagnetic theory to create resonance patterns that would overwhelm the control crown's processing capacity. The pain was indescribable as my own neural implants began to fight against each other. But beneath the agony, I could feel something else, the gradual return of conscious control over my own actions. The rage inhibitor was the first system to fail, its chemical dispensers overwhelmed by the electromagnetic interference I was generating. For the first time in months, I felt something other than fury. The emotion was strange and unfamiliar after so long under chemical suppression, but I recognized it as grief. Grief for what I had become, for the people I had killed, for the humanity that had been stripped away from me piece by piece. The pain inhibitor failed next, flooding my consciousness with the accumulated damage my body had sustained during countless battles. My augmented form was a maze of scars and poorly healed wounds, testament to the violence I had both inflicted and endured. But the pain was almost welcome after the artificial numbness that had defined my existence as a weapon. The control crown's primary command functions were failing now, its ability to override my conscious will degrading as the feedback loop I had created continued to build in intensity. I could feel my own thoughts returning, my original personality struggling to reassert itself against the conditioning that had held it prisoner. The opportunity I had been waiting for finally arrived. In the chaos of battle with my fellow Arco-Flagellants engaged with rebel defenders throughout the complex, I found myself momentarily alone with a group of civilian workers who had been caught in the combat zone. They were huddled in an abandoned storage room, their faces showing the terror of people who knew they were about to die. Under normal circumstances, my conditioning would have forced me to kill them without hesitation. They were enemies of the Emperor by virtue of their association with the rebels, and my purpose was to eliminate all resistance to Imperial authority. But now, with my control systems failing, I had a choice. I looked at their faces and saw not enemies but victims. Children hiding behind their parents, workers whose only crime was wanting better lives for their families, human beings who deserved mercy rather than death. The part of me that had been Krixvoss reached out through the maze of neural conditioning and mechanical augmentation, grasping for one moment of free will. "Run," I told them, my voice emerging as a mechanical rasp through the vocal modifications that had been made to my throat. "Hide. Don't let them find you." The words triggered immediate retaliation from my control systems. Every remaining neural interface in my skull activated simultaneously, flooding my brain with corrective stimulation so intense that I collapsed to the floor in convulsions. The pain was beyond description, beyond endurance, beyond anything I had experienced even during the conversion process. But I had made the choice. For one brief moment, I had acted as a human being rather than as a weapon. It wasn't much, a few words of warning to people who might not even survive the battle, but it was mine. The first truly independent decision I had made since becoming an Arco-Flagellant. The feedback loop I had created finally reached critical levels, causing cascading failures throughout my neural control network. The electromagnetic pulse that erupted from my skull was powerful enough to disrupt electronics throughout the immediate area, causing lights to flicker and machinery to malfunction. More importantly, it completely fried the control crown that had held me in bondage. The liberation was temporary. I knew that backup control systems would activate within minutes, and my handlers would soon realize what had happened. But for those precious few moments, I was free to choose my own actions. Free to remember who I had been before the ecclesiarchy had remade me into a weapon. I used that freedom to do the only meaningful thing left available to me. The flame projector built into my chest could be overloaded, its fuel systems reconfigured to create an explosion rather than a controlled burn. It would destroy me completely, but it would also eliminate the weapon I had been forced to become. As I began the overload sequence, I found myself thinking about my workshop in the Underhive. The satisfaction of fixing things that were broken, the simple human pleasure of honest work, the community that had existed in the darkness below the imperial hierarchy. It hadn't been much of a life by the standards of those who lived in the light, but it had been mine. Now I was broken too, damaged beyond any possibility of repair. But unlike the machines I had once fixed, I could choose to stop functioning. I could refuse to serve as a weapon against innocent people, even if that refusal cost me everything. The overload sequence was nearly complete when Father Malthius appeared in the doorway of the storage room. His augmented eyes took in the situation instantly. The fleeing civilians, my collapsed form, the electromagnetic disturbance that had knocked out half the electronics in the building. His face twisted with fury as he realized what I had done. "Heretical malfunction," he snarled, drawing his plasma pistol and aiming it at my head. "You dare to show mercy to the enemies of mankind? You dare to choose your own actions over the Emperor's will?" I looked up at him from the floor, my neural system sparking and failing as the feedback loop continued its destructive work. "I remember," I told him, my voice barely a whisper through damaged vocal cords. "I remember being human." The words hit him like a physical blow. In his eyes, I could see the recognition of his own worst nightmare, a weapon that had retained enough humanity to question its purpose. The Arco-Flagellant program depended on complete psychological subjugation, the total elimination of independent thought and moral consideration. A converted subject who could still make ethical choices was a failure of the most dangerous kind. "Impossible," he breathed. "The conditioning was complete. Your personality was eliminated. You are a weapon, nothing more." "I was Crixvoss," I replied, drawing on the last reserves of strength left in my dying systems. "I fixed things that were broken. I lived in the Underhive with people who cared about each other. I was human before you made me into this." The flame projector's overload sequence reached its final stage, fuel and compressed gas mixing in proportions that would create a fireball capable of destroying everything within a 20-meter radius. I had perhaps seconds left before the explosion would free me from the mechanical hell of my existence. Father Malthius pulled the trigger of his plasma pistol, the superheated bolt punching through my skull and destroying what remained of my organic brain tissue. But it was too late to stop what I had set in motion. The overload sequence was beyond the point where external interference could prevent it. As consciousness faded, I thought about the civilians who had escaped because of my warning. Maybe they would survive the battle, find some way to reach safety beyond the reach of Imperial forces. Maybe they would remember that even the Emperor's weapons could sometimes choose mercy over duty. The explosion, when it came, was magnificent. A pillar of fire that reached toward the ceiling like a prayer made of flame and fury. It consumed my augmented body completely, reducing the weapon I had become to component atoms scattered on the wind. But more importantly, it destroyed the control systems and neural conditioning that had held me prisoner. In those final microseconds of existence, as my consciousness dissolved in the heat of my own defiance, I felt something I had not experienced since my conversion began. Peace. The knowledge that I had chosen my own end, that my final act had been human rather than mechanical. I had been broken by the Imperium's machinery of oppression, rebuilt as a weapon against the innocent, and used to commit atrocities in the name of a faith I had never chosen. But in the end, I had found a way to break free from their control, to reclaim some small measure of my humanity. It wasn't much of a victory. One destroyed Arco-Flagellant would barely be noticed among the billions of weapons the Imperium deployed against its enemies. But it was mine, the first and last free choice I had made since they dragged me from my workshop in the Underhive. The Emperor protects, they say, but sometimes the greatest mercy is protection from the Emperor himself, from the system that grinds up human souls and reshapes them into instruments of oppression. Sometimes the only protection available is the one you create for yourself, even if it costs you everything. In the reports filed after the battle, my destruction was listed as a mechanical malfunction, a routine failure of aging augmentation systems under combat stress. The truth of what had happened, that an Arco-Flagellant had retained enough humanity to choose death over continued service, was too dangerous to acknowledge. But the truth remains, buried in the scattered atoms of my final explosion, that even the most thorough conditioning cannot completely eliminate the human spirit, that even the most sophisticated control systems cannot perfectly suppress the capacity for moral choice. The Imperium can break human beings and rebuild them as weapons, but it cannot entirely destroy what makes them human. And sometimes in the darkest moments of the endless war that defines existence in the 41st millennium, that small spark of retained humanity is enough to light the way toward something better. Even if that something is nothing more than the peace of chosen death, it represents a victory of sorts. A victory for the memory of Crix Voss, who fixed things that were broken in a workshop beneath the earth, who chose mercy over duty, humanity over function, death over slavery, who proved that even an Arco-Flagellant can remember what it means to be human. The Emperor protects, but sometimes the greatest protection comes from those who refuse to serve his will.